The summer of 1456 opened with a tension that felt almost unreal across Europe. The continent was still reeling from the shock of Constantinople's fall only 3 years earlier, and now another storm had gathered along the banks of the Danube. For 19 relentless days the fate of Christian Europe rested on the walls of a single fortress. Rising above the confluence of two great rivers stood Belgrade, a city that should have been only another stepping stone in the path of a triumphant empire. Yet as the heat of July settled over the plains, a massive Ottoman host advanced with a purpose that terrified kingdoms from the Adriatic to the Alps. Tens of thousands of soldiers hardened by decades of conquest marched beneath the banners of Mehmed II. Chroniclers of the time insisted the army numbered 100,000, though modern scholars tend to place it lower. Still, the sight of such a force would have crushed the spirit of any ordinary garrison. Arrayed behind its cannons and elite infantry was a ruler who had already torn down Constantinople's ancient walls and proclaimed himself master of 2 continents. His ambition was to break Hungary wide open and thrust the Ottoman frontier deep into Central Europe. If Belgrade fell, nothing substantial stood between his forces and the heartland of the West. Within the fortress walls fewer than 7,000 defenders prepared for a siege that by any calculation should have ended quickly and disastrously. Hungarian soldiers, Serbian volunteers, militia from the surrounding countryside, and ordinary townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder on the battlements. They were outnumbered more than 14 to 1, cut off from most noble support, and pitted against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. Yet history often turns on the resolve of people who refuse to yield. What unfolded over the coming days would not only save a single city, but halt an expansion that threatened to reshape the entire balance of power in Europe. It would turn Belgrade from a regional fortress into a symbol of resilience, leadership, and unlikely victory. This is Great History, where we explore the hidden strategies, bold decisions, and human determination that alter the course of civilizations. And so the question stands, how did a small and fractured force manage to withstand a storm that seemed destined to crush them? What transformed Belgrade into a bulwark that artillery and overwhelming numbers could not break? To understand the stakes we must return to the aftermath of Constantinople's collapse in 1453. That event sent ripples through every court and church in Europe. Mehmed II, already known for bold military innovation, wasted no time after taking the Byzantine capital. The fall of the city ended the 1,000-year-old Eastern Roman Empire and removed the last major barrier protecting Europe from Ottoman expansion. Nobles and rulers who once believed geography would shield them suddenly faced a terrifying new reality. The path northward was now open. Mehmed acted swiftly, absorbing nearby territories such as the Despotate of Morea and the Empire of Trebizond. He tightened control over the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. Every move signaled a larger vision, one that reached beyond the Balkans. Belgrade occupied a place of extraordinary strategic importance. It stood at a natural crossroads where rivers carried goods, soldiers, and supplies deep into the heart of Hungary. To hold Belgrade was to command the gateway to Central Europe. To lose it was to invite invasion. Western writers often painted Mehmed as a conqueror driven solely by ambition and wealth, but within the Ottoman worldview his campaign represented the continuation of a long-standing ideal. It was the expansion of political and spiritual authority, the advance of an empire that believed itself destined to rule new lands. Mehmed remembered well earlier Ottoman attempts to capture Belgrade that had failed. This time he would not allow setbacks. With meticulous planning, he gathered a force that combined heavy artillery, elite janissaries, trained infantry, cavalry, and a river fleet. It was a fusion of technologies and tactics that had shattered Constantinople, and was expected to do the same here. Contemporary accounts describe more than 300 cannons, including giant bombards capable of sending stone balls heavy enough to tear down fortifications built to withstand medieval invasions. The Ottomans even built foundries in Serbia to keep their artillery in constant repair throughout the campaign. The river fleet, possibly numbering anywhere from 20 to 200 vessels, was meant to dominate the Danube and Sava, cutting the fortress off from reinforcements and supplies. Mehmed's plan was not reckless. It was a calculated demonstration of imperial might. Meanwhile, Hungary was suffering from its own turmoil. The kingdom was deeply divided, its nobles more concerned with internal rivalries than with the danger growing to the south. Many resented the rising influence of John Hunyadi, the one commander who had repeatedly defeated Ottoman forces in the past. Pope Calixtus III, watching from Rome, understood what many rulers refused to see. If Belgrade fell, nothing would stop the Ottomans from reaching further north. Determined to prevent a catastrophe, the Pope funneled Vatican resources into Hungary. He sold treasures, tightened the church's budget, and issued pleas urging every Christian kingdom to pray for the defenders. But political cooperation was scarce. King Ladislaus V withdrew to Vienna, and the bulk of the Hungarian nobility ignored calls for a crusade. So the responsibility of defending the gateway to Europe fell into the hands of a few determined leaders. John Hunyadi took on that burden willingly. A brilliant strategist and experienced commander, he understood that time was almost gone. Without broad support from the kingdom, he relied on his own wealth and influence to gather a force of 10,000 to 12,000 professional soldiers. He also organized a flotilla of small riverboats, around 200 vessels, to challenge Ottoman control of the Danube. His goal was clear: reinforce the fortress and disrupt the blockade before Belgrade collapsed. But he could not be inside the city at the start of the siege. Instead he entrusted its defense to his brother-in-law, Mihai Shalagi, a capable commander who led roughly 7,000 defenders within the walls. Serbia stood helplessly between two powers. Its ruler, Durad Brankovic, attempted to navigate the conflict through diplomacy. Marriage alliances and temporary treaties brought brief moments of peace, but they offered no true security. When Mehmed marched his army through Serbian lands on the way to Belgrade, a small Serbian force of 9,000 men tried to resist. They were swept aside on June 18th. It was a grim reminder that neutrality offered no shield against a determined empire. Belgrade's defenses were strong but outdated in the face of new technology. The city rose in tiers, the outer town protected by thick walls, and above it the imposing upper citadel with commanding views of both rivers. Shalagi knew the walls would not endure the giant cannons forever. His task was to delay the Ottomans until Hunyadi arrived. The bombardment began almost immediately. Day after day, the earth trembled as hundreds of cannons roared. Massive stone shot shattered towers, ripped holes through battlements, and sent clouds of dust and rock raining onto the defenders. Each thunderous impact was a reminder that time was running out. Yet the defenders worked tirelessly. As soon as darkness fell, teams rushed to rebuild broken sections, fill gaps, and reinforce fragile areas with whatever materials they could find. They rationed food, conserved arrows, and coordinated shifts to maintain round-the-clock vigilance. The morale of the garrison depended not on overwhelming strength, but on discipline and trust in the hope that reinforcements were on the way. Mehmed complemented his artillery assault with a river blockade. His fleet spread across the Danube, forming a dense barrier meant to stop Hunyadi's approach. Some reports describe chains stretched across the river or ships anchored so tightly that a boat could barely pass between them. This chokehold was designed to isolate Belgrade entirely. A fortress without supplies would eventually surrender even if its walls remained standing. So the defenders held on through the first week, their world reduced to collapsing walls, thunderous cannon fire, dwindling provisions, and constant fear that the next bombardment might finally open a fatal breach. Every hour mattered. Every repair was a small victory. Every day the walls remained standing brought hope that Hunyadi was getting closer. Belgrade was not fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. By the time the siege reached its second week, the situation inside Belgrade had stretched the defenders to the limits of human endurance. Dust hung in the air like a permanent fog, the thunder of artillery never ceased, and each new sunrise revealed another section of wall chipped, cracked, or blown open by Mehmed's relentless bombardment. Shalagi and his men patched breaches every night, but even the bravest soldiers wondered how much longer the fortress could stand. Supplies dwindled. Morale wavered. And above all, the river blockade held firm, at least for the moment. Mehmed believed that if he controlled the Danube, Belgrade's fall was only a matter of time. But outside the city, someone was preparing to challenge that assumption. John Hunyadi had spent weeks assembling a force from whatever resources he could gather. His professional soldiers, veterans seasoned in years of border warfare, formed the core of his army. But what truly expanded his ranks was something no strategist could have fully predicted: a tide of common people, inspired by the fiery preaching of the Franciscan monk Giovanni da Capistrano. Capistrano had traveled across Hungary calling farmers, townsfolk, students, and priests to take up the cross and defend Christendom. Many arrived with only the clothing on their backs, and the simplest tools turned into makeshift weapons. Their zeal made up for their lack of discipline, and by the time Hunyadi set out, he commanded not just an army but a human wave driven by faith and desperation. To reach Belgrade, Hunyadi needed to break the Ottoman grip on the river. The Danube was the artery through which reinforcements, food, and ammunition had to pass. Yet Mehmed's fleet dominated the waterway. Accounts differ widely on its size, but all agree the blockade was formidable, a screen of galleys, lighter vessels, and possibly chains designed to trap or sink any ship attempting passage. For most commanders, such an obstacle would have been insurmountable. But Hunyadi was not like most commanders. He saw possibilities where others saw dead ends. His flotilla, cobbled together from small riverboats, corvettes, fishing vessels, and armed barges, looked unimpressive compared to the sleek Ottoman galleys. But they were light, fast, and maneuverable, perfect for close-quarters combat. Many were crewed by local Serbs who knew the river better than any map. Their intimate knowledge of currents, shallows, and hidden bends would prove pivotal. On July 14th, Hunyadi launched his daring attack. What followed was not merely a naval battle but a medieval storm of wood, iron, fire, and chaos. Hunyadi's small vessels darted into the blockade like wasps, slamming into larger Ottoman ships, boarding them, and unleashing volleys of arrows and handheld firearms. Smoke rose in columns as ships caught fire. Oars shattered beneath the impact of collisions. The Danube churned with debris and bodies. The fight lasted for more than 5 hours, long enough to turn the river into a battlefield of drifting wreckage. Against all expectation, the Ottomans began to falter. Their larger vessels could not maneuver effectively amid the chaos. One by one, galleys were boarded or pushed aground. 3 large Ottoman warships sank outright, their hulks disappearing beneath the water, while 20 or more smaller vessels were captured intact. The blockade shattered like broken glass. Through that gap poured the lifeblood Belgrade needed to survive. Hunyadi ferried 10,000 to 12,000 professional soldiers into the fortress, along with crates of arrows, barrels of grain, medical supplies, tools for repairs, and weapons. When the gates opened to receive them, cheers rose from the exhausted defenders. For the first time since the siege began, hope surged through the garrison. The Ottomans still outnumbered them by overwhelming margins, but the psychological shift was immense. Mehmed's aura of invincibility had cracked. The Sultan, however, remained undeterred. He intensified the bombardment, determined to smash the walls before Hunyadi's reinforcements could turn the tide. Day after day the giant bombards boomed, each shot throwing shockwaves through the ground. Stones flew from the walls in great chunks. By the 20th day, the outer defenses had suffered so much damage that the Ottomans could finally launch the assault they had been preparing for since the beginning. On the night of July 21st, Mehmed ordered a full-scale attack. Thousands of soldiers surged forward through breaches torn by weeks of cannon fire. The elite Janissaries led the charge, pushing into the lower town beneath the citadel. Fires broke out. Defenders fought desperately from street to street. For a moment, the city seemed ready to collapse just as Constantinople had. But Hunyadi had prepared for this moment. He understood that a direct confrontation against Janissaries in narrow streets would be disastrous. Instead, he devised a plan that combined discipline with a brutal simplicity. He ordered his men to ignite tar-soaked timber and resin-laden materials in areas already captured by the Ottomans. Flames erupted instantly, sweeping through streets the Janissaries had secured only moments earlier. Walls of fire cut them off from reinforcements and turned the battlefield into a blazing maze. Confused, isolated, and unable to move in the tight spaces, many elite troops were cut down. The assault that should have broken Belgrade instead broke the attacking vanguard. Yet it was the next day that would change everything. The vast peasant crusader force encamped across the river had grown restless. Watching the siege from afar, many believed the decisive moment had arrived. Despite strict orders from Hunyadi not to engage, thousands surged forward across makeshift crossings, driven by religious fervor and a desire to strike a blow for their faith. Most had little training and no formal coordination. They carried farm tools and slings instead of swords and shields. The moment they crossed the river, chaos followed. Capistrano raced to stop them but quickly realized they could not be controlled. Instead, he rallied them, turning a potential disaster into a force of divine-charged momentum. He marched at their head shouting encouragements as the massive crowd surged toward the Ottoman rear lines. It was a movement no commander, not even Mehmed himself, had anticipated. The Ottomans scrambled to respond. Units of Sipahi cavalry abandoned their positions to confront the unexpected threat. In the process they exposed one of the most vital components of the siege, Mehmed's artillery camp. These great cannons were the instruments that had torn Belgrade's walls open. Without them the Ottoman strategy would crumble. Hunyadi saw the opportunity with the clarity of an experienced battlefield commander. He immediately gathered his professional troops and launched a coordinated attack aimed directly at the artillery. While the Ottomans were still repositioning to respond to the peasant assault, Hunyadi's soldiers stormed the gun emplacements. Fighting exploded around the massive bombards. Gunners were cut down. Horses tore loose from wagons. Cannon crews scrambled to defend their positions. For the first time in the siege, the Ottomans found themselves fighting in two directions at once, against a disciplined army in front and against a chaotic wave of zealots behind. The battlefield fractured. Communication broke apart. The Janissary Guard charged in an attempt to protect the artillery, but in the confusion they were overwhelmed. Their commander Hassan Aga fell in the struggle, his death sending shockwaves through the elite corps. The tide had turned. The guns that were meant to destroy Belgrade now lay silent and captured. As the Ottomans reeled, Mehmed too personally rode into the fray, attempting to rally his soldiers with displays of courage. Chroniclers claim he fought hand-to-hand with a Hungarian knight, killing him even as arrows flew around him. But then fate intervened. An arrow struck the Sultan in the thigh. He collapsed, and rumors of his death or severe injury spread instantly. Ottoman morale broke. Commanders struggled to restore order but failed. Units began to withdraw. Others panicked and ran. What had been a siege on the brink of victory dissolved into an uncontrolled retreat. As night fell, the great Ottoman army abandoned artillery, supplies, and wounded men. Mehmed was carried from the field, and by morning the plains surrounding Belgrade lay silent. The siege was over. Belgrade had survived. What should have been an inevitable Ottoman victory became one of the greatest defensive triumphs in European history. A victory forged from courage, chaos, discipline, and a single moment of opportunity seized by a commander who understood exactly when and where to strike. Dawn rose quietly over the Danube the morning after the Ottoman retreat. Smoke drifted across the ruined fields where thousands had clashed the day before. Inside Belgrade, the defenders could barely believe what they were seeing. After 19 days of relentless bombardment, dwindling supplies, broken walls, and constant fear, the vast Ottoman army was gone. Abandoned cannons, some of them the largest in the world, sat silent in muddy pits. Tents lay collapsed or half-burned. Horses wandered freely among shattered wagons. What had begun as one of the most ambitious military campaigns of the century had ended in a hasty withdrawal. Belgrade had not simply survived, it had repelled a force that all of Europe believed to be unstoppable. In the short term, the victory was transformative. For Hungary, it meant the southern frontier was secure, at least temporarily. Mehmed II, who had swept through the Balkans with astonishing speed, suddenly found his momentum shattered. Though still a ruler of immense ambition, he now faced a sobering reality. The road into Central Europe was not as open as it had seemed. His armies would not launch another major offensive toward Hungary for nearly 70 years. It was only in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs that the Ottomans regained the initiative in the region. This long pause, created by the defense of Belgrade, granted Europe a rare window of stability during a period of enormous cultural and political transformation. Renaissance scholarship flourished. Kingdoms strengthened their institutions. Trade routes expanded. Diplomacy matured. In a very real sense, those 19 days helped shape the conditions that allowed Europe to consolidate its identity before facing new challenges in the 16th century. Yet the victory did not resolve all problems. The deeper conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the European powers remained far from over. Belgrade's triumph was a delay, not a conclusion. Both sides would continue to clash for centuries in campaigns stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Still, the psychological blow inflicted on Mehmed's army was undeniable. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had seemed invincible, had suffered his first major defeat. It was a humbling moment that reminded the world that empires, no matter how powerful, were not immune to failure. In the aftermath, the question of who deserved credit for the victory became a source of heated debate. Letters, chronicles, and reports from the period reveal a complex picture. John Hunyadi viewed the triumph as the culmination of his strategy. The river battle, the fortification repairs, the counterattack on the artillery, and the careful exploitation of battlefield chaos. In his correspondence he emphasized the planning and discipline that had allowed the defenders to seize the decisive moment. Giovanni da Capistrano, meanwhile, wrote of the victory in spiritual terms. To him it was a miracle accomplished by faith, prayer, and divine intervention. He celebrated the courage of the peasant crusaders whose unscripted charge had opened the door for Hunyadi's assault. Papal officials echoed Capistrano's version, emphasizing the role of religious fervor and portraying the victory as proof that God favored the defenders. European rulers, many of whom had provided little support during the crisis, found Capistrano's narrative politically convenient. By highlighting the monk and the crusaders, they could downplay their own inaction while still celebrating the result. Meanwhile, in local Hungarian and Serbian traditions, Hunyadi and the professional soldiers were hailed as the true heroes. Folk tales later exaggerated individual deeds, weaving legends around certain warriors. One of the most famous stories spoke of Titus Dugovic, a man who supposedly wrestled an Ottoman soldier from the walls to prevent the Sultan's banner from being raised, both men plunging to their deaths. Although historians now believe such tales were literary inventions, they illustrate how powerfully the siege resonated with people across the region. Victory invited myth-making just as much as defeat had invited fear. Modern scholarship cuts through the exaggerations and reveals a more balanced truth. The defense of Belgrade succeeded not because of one man or one miracle, but because of the convergence of three crucial elements. First was the determination and endurance of Mihai Shalagi and the garrison who held the fortress through the most intense bombardment Europe had seen since Constantinople. Second was the strategic brilliance of John Hunyadi, whose use of river warfare, battlefield timing, and adaptability turned opportunities into decisive breakthroughs. Third was the unpredictable but essential role of Capistrano's crusader masses, whose sheer numbers and unrestrained zeal created chaos in Ottoman lines at the exact moment when the defenders needed it most. Each element alone would have failed. Together they overwhelmed an army that should have been invincible. But fate is often cruel to victors. Barely 3 weeks after the siege ended, John Hunyadi fell ill with plague. Exhausted from the campaign and weakened by the conditions of the camp, he died on August 11, 1456. His death shook the Kingdom of Hungary. For decades he had been the one figure capable of rallying the nobility and organizing defenses against Ottoman expansion. Without him, Hungary lost not only a general but a unifying force. Only a few months later, Giovanni da Capistrano succumbed to the same plague, dying on October 23. These two men who had stood at the center of the victory did not live to witness the long-term impact of their achievement. Their absence created a political vacuum at a moment when Hungary needed strong and coordinated leadership more than ever. Though the kingdom struggled in the following years, Hunyadi's legacy endured through his son Matthias Corvinus, who rose to the throne in 1458. Matthias built one of the most respected courts in Europe, and worked tirelessly to strengthen the military and administrative structure his father had envisioned. While he could not erase the internal divisions that plagued the kingdom, he helped preserve Hungary as a bulwark for decades. One of the most extraordinary cultural symbols to emerge from the siege was the tradition of ringing church bells at noon. Pope Calixtus III originally ordered the bells to be rung to call Christians across Europe to pray for Belgrade's defenders. But news traveled slowly. In many places word of the victory arrived before the order itself was enacted. As a result, the midday bells became a celebration rather than a plea for divine help. The Pope later modified the decree to honor the triumph officially. Even today Catholic churches around the world ring their bells at noon, a faint echo of the moment when a beleaguered fortress turned back one of the most feared armies in history. Belgrade's defense became more than a military success. It became a symbol of unity in a time of fragmentation. It demonstrated that leadership, courage, faith, and quick thinking could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. It reminded Europe that borders are held not solely by walls but by the resolve of those who stand upon them. And it marked a turning point in the long struggle between two worlds, each striving to shape the future of the continent. In the end, the story of Belgrade in 1456 is a testament to the power of determination. It is a reminder that history is often shaped not by the size of armies but by the conviction of the people who refuse to surrender even when defeat seems certain. 19 days of endurance transformed a modest fortress into an immortal emblem of resistance. And through that victory Europe gained time. Time to rebuild, time to strengthen, time to prepare for the next great chapter in its unfolding story. If you enjoyed uncovering the strategy, courage, and human drama behind this epic moment, be sure to join us for more explorations into the battles, empires, and turning points that shaped the world. Your curiosity keeps history alive, and your voice helps guide the stories we tell next.